Captain Emily Hawke stood at the helm of the Aegis, her fingers hovering over the glowing console as the stars streaked by in the endless void of deep space. The mission was routine, another survey of a distant system, another attempt to chart the unknown. But something had changed. The deep silence of space was interrupted by a faint signal, a frequency no one had heard before. At first, it seemed like a mistake, just background noise from the ship's own systems, but it was persistent, and it was growing stronger. The communications officer, Lieutenant Jackson, shifted nervously, his eyes glued to the readout as he analyzed the anomaly, his voice barely above a whisper. "Captain, this signal, it doesn't match anything we've ever seen. It's not just noise. There's a pattern hidden beneath it." Hawke's eyes narrowed. The pattern could mean a lot of things, one of them being something important or something dangerous, and the more the signal grew, the more she felt something nagging at her instincts. She looked out at the stars through the bridge's viewport, knowing that nothing out here was ever truly quiet. The universe had a way of hiding its secrets in the deepest corners, and she had a feeling that this time the signal wasn't just a passing oddity, but a message, a key to something no human had ever discovered. The decision was made quickly. "Jackson, lock on to the source of that signal. We're going to investigate." He hesitated for a moment, but then nodded without argument, setting course for the uncharted system. The source of the signal lay in a place too remote for any human vessel to venture regularly, and the farther they pushed toward it, the more the silence seemed to intensify. It was as though the entire universe had grown still, watching them as they approached. Hawke paced the bridge, her thoughts flickering through 1,000 scenarios. What could it be? Who could have sent it? How had it survived all this time? Space was vast and cruel, and anything this far out was generally left alone by anyone who wasn't desperate or foolish. But the Aegis wasn't a ship for fear. It was built for exploration and discovery, and Hawke had always been one to trust her instincts. After several days of travel, the system came into view, a cold, dark star at its center, surrounded by a belt of asteroid debris, and within that debris, a faint shimmer on the edge of their sensors. They had found it. The signal had been coming from something enormous, a massive ship or structure hidden in plain sight beneath layers of rock and dust. As the Aegis drew closer, the size of the object became apparent. It was unlike anything Hawke had seen before. The shape was wrong, too angular, too precise. It was not the smooth curves of modern design, but the harsh and deliberate angles of something ancient. The crew's attention was now fully focused on it. They had found what had been calling to them, a warship adrift in space. Yet it wasn't just any ship. It was a relic that shouldn't be here at all. They maneuvered cautiously toward it, and when they finally docked, the silence on the ship was deafening. No signals, no messages, just an emptiness that seemed to radiate from the ship's very hull. Nothing made sense. How could such a massive object be here? How could it have survived all this time in the cold void of space? And yet, as Hawke stared at its dark silhouette, she felt a strange pull, a sense of destiny, as if this ship had been waiting for them all along. The Aegis hovered in silence beside the strange warship, its silhouette looming like an ancient predator waiting for its prey. Captain Hawke stood at the airlock, her mind racing with questions. What had happened to this ship? Who had built it? And why had it been left alone in the void for so long? She felt the weight of the crew's eyes on her as she turned to face them. This was uncharted territory, even for them, and every step forward was a step into the unknown. Lieutenant Jackson stood by her side, his hand resting on the weapon at his belt. "Captain, the systems are powered down, but we're still getting strange energy readings from the ship's core. It's almost like it's alive." Hawke nodded, her stomach twisted with the gravity of the situation. There was no way they were going to turn back now. This was a discovery like no other, but it was also a risk they couldn't ignore. She took a deep breath and turned to the rest of the team, who were already preparing their gear. The exploration team consisted of 4 other officers, each equipped with suits designed for zero-gravity maneuvering and long-range scanning. No one had any idea what to expect, but they had been trained for the impossible. There was no hesitation among them. As they lined up to board the mysterious vessel, the airlock hissed as it sealed behind them, and with a lurch the connection between the two ships was made. The instant the outer doors opened, they were met with a thick, almost oppressive silence. Inside the ship it was dark, save for the dim glow from the control panels. that lined the walls. The design of the ship was unlike anything they had encountered before. Sharp, jagged lines and angular shapes dominated the architecture. No smooth surfaces, nothing familiar at all. The air tasted old, stale, but breathable. Hawk stepped forward into the darkness of the unknown, her boots echoing faintly on the hard metal floors. She was immediately struck by how quiet everything was. Every step felt as though they were intruding on something ancient, something that had been waiting for them. The rest of the team followed closely behind, scanning their surroundings with equipment designed to detect even the smallest anomaly. Nothing seemed to be working. The scanners flickered and buzzed in confusion. There were no signs of life. No crew, no automated systems. The ship seemed entirely abandoned. And yet there was an undeniable presence about it, as if it were still functional despite its appearance. Hawk couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. The deeper they ventured into the heart of the ship, the more disorienting it became. Nothing made sense. The walls shimmered with strange markings that seemed to change depending on the angle at which they were viewed. Some were geometric patterns, others looked like symbols. They couldn't even begin to understand. The very air around them felt thick, as though it was saturated with energy, and it hummed quietly beneath the surface, like a heart beating in the distance. It wasn't until they reached the central chamber that they felt something truly unsettling. The room was massive, and round a vast open space, with a single large console at its center. It was a sleek black structure that almost seemed to pulse with a faint glow, as if it were alive. Without a word, Hawk moved toward it, her hand hovering over the smooth surface of the console, as if some unseen force was guiding her closer to it. The others watched in silence. When she finally pressed a button, the ship seemed to come alive around them. The hum grew louder, and the room flooded with light. In an instant, the air thickened with energy, and the walls flickered as though they were alive. The console began to display strange symbols and data in a language none of them could read, but the screen shifted quickly, showing images of distant stars, ancient galaxies, and ships locked in battle. The ship had a story to tell, and it was starting to reveal it to them piece by piece. The moment the console lit up, the air in the chamber seemed to thicken, as if the ship itself had just awakened from a long slumber. Captain Hawk stepped back, her breath caught in her throat. The strange symbols flickered across the screen, swirling and shifting in ways that no human technology could replicate. The ship was communicating with them, or at least attempting to. The images on the console shifted rapidly. Stars being born, worlds being destroyed, cosmic battles that spanned eons. Everything felt too massive, too ancient, for human minds to comprehend. Lieutenant Jackson approached cautiously, scanning the symbols with his translator device. His eyes widened as the translation began to take shape. Captain, these aren't just data logs. They're histories. And warnings. Warnings about something. Someone. Coming back. Hawk's heart skipped a beat. What do you mean? What is it? Jackson looked at the symbols, his face pale. This ship was built to fight something. An entity. A force. It doesn't just consume planets. It erases them. Entire galaxies. Wiped out. The images. It's showing us a cosmic war. The others gathered around, drawn into the mystery unfolding on the screen. Ensign Mira, the ship's expert on ancient languages, stood silently, studying the symbols with an intensity that suggested she was piecing together something important. It's almost like the ship's trying to tell us what it was built for, she said softly. But why us? Why now? Hawk felt a chill run down her spine. There was a pull in her chest, an undeniable connection to the ship, as though it had chosen them for something greater. Something they didn't understand yet. She pressed a hand to the console, trying to make sense of the flood of information. As her fingers made contact, a surge of energy shot through the room. The walls hummed louder, and the floor seemed to vibrate beneath her feet. A new image flashed across the screen, vast, twisting tendrils of darkness reaching through space, tearing apart stars and planets alike. The ship's system seemed to pulse with a sense of urgency, the console flooding with data faster than anyone could process. Then, as suddenly as it had started, the transmission stopped, and the screen went black. The room fell silent, except for the faint hum of the ship's systems. Hawk stumbled back from the console, her mind racing. What was that? What just happened? Jackson rubbed his temples, still processing the flood of information. It's not just a ship. It's a weapon. A weapon that was built to fight this entity. It's showing us the war, the history, and the devastation. The others looked at one another, the weight of their discovery settling in. It was clear now that this ship, abandoned and hidden in the void, wasn't just a relic of a lost civilization. It was the last piece of a long-forgotten defense against something far worse. Why would it reveal this to us? Lieutenant Doran, the ship's weapons officer, asked. If it's meant to fight something, why show us the past? We can't even understand most of it. Hawk looked at the flickering console, the soft glow now pulsing like a heartbeat. Maybe it's not showing us the past. Maybe it's showing us the future. A shiver ran through the group. The idea was too big, too impossible to grasp. But as Hawk stared at the empty screen, she knew one thing for certain. Whatever this warship had been waiting for, it wasn't a mere history lesson. The threat it had been built to face was drawing closer, and they were now somehow tied to its fate. And that connection, however mysterious, was the only thing that stood between them and something far worse than they could imagine. The air felt heavy again, as though the ship itself had begun to stir, to make them part of its plan. Hawk felt the undeniable truth settling in her chest. They had no choice now. They had to learn to use the ship, to fight, even if they didn't yet understand what they were fighting against. As the lights flickered back to life, the ship's hum deepened, and Hawk took a breath, preparing herself for what lay ahead. The warship had awoken, and so had their destiny. The Aegis had barely settled into orbit around the alien warship when the first tremors were felt. It was subtle at first, just a slight disturbance in the ship's systems, but it quickly grew worse. The once quiet hum of the ship intensified, and the air seemed to grow thicker, charged with a strange energy. The crew looked to each other, confused, uncertain. Something had changed. Captain Hawk stood in front of the viewport, staring at the distant stars. There was no reason for the ship to be acting like this, not when they hadn't done anything more than explore. But then, as if to answer her thoughts, a red alert blared across the bridge. "Captain," Jackson called, his voice taut. "Incoming vessels. We've detected something massive, approaching fast." Hawk turned to face him, her heart pounding in her chest. The sensors had been scanning the area for hours, and nothing had shown up. Now suddenly, they were being targeted by something. A lot of somethings. "Can you get a reading on their origin?" she asked, trying to keep her voice steady. Jackson's hands flew over the console. "I'm trying, but the readings are all distorted. They're moving too fast, too erratically." "Do we know what they are?" Doran asked, stepping up to the tactical station. His eyes narrowed as he looked at the shifting patterns on the screen. "They're not anything we've ever encountered," Jackson muttered, his voice a mix of awe and concern. "They don't look like ships. They look more like anomalies. Something's wrong with the way they're moving. They're bending the space around them." Hawk's stomach dropped. "How close are they?" 500 kilometers and closing fast," Jackson replied, tension thick in his voice. "They're almost here." There was a long, tense silence as the crew exchanged glances. Something was happening. The ship wasn't just an ancient relic. It was part of a larger puzzle, and whatever it had been built for, it was far from over. It was clear now. The enemy the warship had once fought was returning, and it wasn't waiting for them to figure things out. "Prepare for evasive maneuvers," Hawk ordered, her voice cutting through the tension. "Raise shields. Get me a clear firing solution. We can't outrun them, but we can fight." The crew moved swiftly into action, each one operating on pure instinct, honed by years of training. But no amount of preparation could have prepared them for what happened next. A strange pulse rippled through the ship's hull, shaking it like a leaf in a storm. The entire bridge went dark for a fraction of a second, and when the lights flickered back on, the enemy ships were no longer just distant blips on the radar. They were right on top of them. They didn't look like any conventional warship. They were dark, almost featureless, with jagged edges that seemed to distort the very space around them. The shapes twisted and warped, as though they existed in multiple dimensions at once. The feeling of dread in the air was palpable. The crew could feel it in their bones. These weren't ships. They were something else, something far more terrifying. The anomalies flickered, their forms shifting in and out of reality, as if their very presence was a violation of space-time. "This can't be real," Mira whispered, her voice shaking. "It's like they're not even here. They're everywhere." The pulse from the enemy ships hit the Aegis like a shockwave, and the ship rocked violently. The force knocked the crew off their feet, sending consoles sparking and alarms blaring. But as the Aegis struggled to regain control, the warship in the distance, still floating in space, abandoned and silent, responded. The warship's dormant core began to glow with an eerie light, and its systems hummed to life. A surge of power shot through the ship's network, flooding the Aegis with energy. It was as though the warship had recognized the enemy and was preparing for something far worse than any human conflict. "Captain," Jackson said, his voice filled with urgency. "The warship's activating. It's responding to the enemy. It's ready to fight." Hawk felt a surge of hope mixed with fear. The warship was more than just a relic. It was a weapon, and it was waking up. But she knew, in the deepest part of her heart, that this fight wasn't going to be easy. The universe had thrown them into something far bigger than they had imagined. And the enemy was already here, waiting to finish what it had started eons ago. "We don't have much time," she said, her voice steady despite the chaos. "Prepare for a fight. The warship may be our only chance to survive." The crew nodded in unison, their determination hardening. The battle for the universe was about to begin. The Aegis shook again, the entire ship reverberating as the dark anomalies surrounding them surged with energy. Their bizarre, twisting forms flickered in and out of sight, as though they were not bound by the same laws of reality that governed the human ships. The crew braced themselves, unable to look away from the chaos unfolding before them. The once still alien warship, dormant for whom knew how many millennia, was now alive and pulsing with a strange, unimaginable power. "Captain," Jackson said through gritted teeth, "the enemy's positioning itself for another strike. It's not giving us any time to breathe." Hawk's gaze shifted to the viewport, her mind racing. The warship they had discovered was their only hope, but they didn't yet understand how to use it. Their enemy, these nightmarish, shifting entities, had already demonstrated a terrifying power, and the Aegis was vulnerable without the right weapons. "Ensign Mira," Hawk called, her voice tense. "Can you access anything from the warship's core? Any defenses? Anything at all?" Mira nodded, her fingers flying over the controls, eyes scanning the alien data with a growing sense of dread. "I'm trying, Captain, but it's like the system's locked. It's almost as if it's waiting for us to unlock it, to prove we're worthy." "Worthy?" Doran muttered, disbelief thick in his voice. "You can't be serious. We need a weapon now, not some ancient trial." The dark, warped ships outside the viewport flickered again, their eerie movements distorting the space around them. It was clear they weren't just ships. They were a living presence, a vast, unknowable force, and they were coming for them. "I'm going to try something," Hawk said, her voice unwavering. "If the warship is alive, then maybe it will respond to us the way a living being would." Before anyone could protest, she moved toward the central control panel of the alien warship's interface. The console hummed as she placed her hand on it, the same strange pulse of energy surging through her fingertips. The symbols on the screen shifted once more, reacting to her touch. The energy in the room thickened, and for a moment, it felt as though the entire ship was watching her, waiting. "Captain, be careful," Jackson warned, his voice tense. "We have no idea what this thing might do." But Hawk didn't falter. She had made her decision. As her fingers traced the symbols on the console, a series of complex geometric shapes appeared, one after another, like pieces of a puzzle slowly coming together. The ship's core seemed to respond, resonating with the movement of her hand. She felt a growing hum in her chest, like the warship itself was beginning to understand her, or perhaps it was testing her. Suddenly, the console flared to life. A new set of symbols appeared, followed by a blinding burst of light. Hawk staggered back, her heart racing. The entire room seemed to shift, as though reality itself were warping. For a moment, the ship flickered between dimensions, its edges becoming both present and absent at the same time. And then, just as quickly as it had started, the light died down, leaving an eerie calm in its wake. "Captain, I think it worked," Mira said in a hushed tone, her eyes wide. "There's something new." The walls of the ship flickered again, revealing a hidden chamber deep within its core, a chamber that had been sealed away, buried beneath centuries of decay. Hawk's breath caught as she realized what she was seeing. A weapon, but it wasn't like anything they had ever encountered. It was a massive energy cannon, embedded deep within the heart of the warship, its form both organic and mechanical. Its sheer size dwarfed anything human engineering could have ever conceived. But what stood out most was the eerie, pulsating core at its center. It seemed alive, breathing with an energy that was far beyond the human comprehension of weaponry. "The cannon," Duran whispered. "It's the weapon. But how do we use it?" Hawk stepped closer, her mind working furiously. The cannon wasn't just a weapon. It was a manifestation of the ship's purpose, designed to unleash destruction on a scale they couldn't fully understand. But it was dormant. Until now. "This weapon was designed to fight something beyond anything we've ever faced," Hawk said, turning to the crew. "It's been waiting for us to activate it, to prove we're worthy of wielding it. And we don't have a choice. We need it to survive." "But how?" Jackson asked, still uncertain. "How do we even know it'll work?" "We won't know until we try," Hawk said, her voice resolute. "Prepare the ship. We're going to need every bit of power we can muster." The crew quickly set to work, securing the necessary connections between the Aegis and the warship's systems. As the cannon powered up, a strange hum filled the air, the room vibrating with the sheer energy being unleashed. Hawk felt it deep in her bones. This was the weapon that could turn the tide of the battle, but they still didn't fully understand it. The real question was, would they be able to control it long enough to make a difference? The enemy ships were closing in fast. Time was running out. "We'll figure it out as we go," Hawk muttered, her fingers tightening on the controls. "We have no other choice." The weapon had awoken, and the battle was about to reach its breaking point. The weapon's hum filled the air, a deep, resonating vibration that seemed to pulse through the entire ship. Captain Hawk stood at the helm of the Aegis, her eyes fixed on the viewports as the enemy vessels closed in, their warped forms bending space with every movement. The ship's systems were fully linked to the alien warship now, and its power surged into the Aegis. She could feel the energy in the air, almost like a storm gathering, preparing for release. Jackson glanced nervously at the console. "Captain, we're nearly at full charge, but it doesn't make sense. The readings are all over the place. This cannon, it's not just firing energy. It feels like it's manipulating the fabric of space itself." "Does it matter?" Hawk asked, her voice low but steady. "We don't have time to figure it out. We need to strike before they do." Duran, standing by the tactical station, adjusted the targeting parameters. "We can hit them with everything we got, Captain. But we'll only have one shot before the enemy adapts." The enemy ships were almost upon them now. They no longer looked like ships in the conventional sense. Their forms rippled and shifted, moving through space like living things, their dark, twisting shapes becoming even more erratic. Hawk's stomach twisted with the realization that these things were not just invaders. They were something beyond comprehension, something that defied every rule of physics they understood. "Ready the weapon," Hawk ordered, her voice cutting through the tension. "Prepare to fire on my command." The entire crew held their breath as the weapon inside the alien warship began to glow brighter, its core pulsing in sync with the beats of their own hearts. The light in the room grew blinding, and the ship hummed louder. It was no longer just a machine. It was alive, connected to them, waiting for a signal. Jackson's eyes widened as he noticed the readings. "Captain, the weapon. It's linked directly to us. It's waiting for our will to fire." Hawk didn't hesitate. She had been waiting for this moment, for the moment when everything they'd fought for, everything they'd sacrificed, would culminate in a single action. They had the power now, if they could control it, if they could harness it. She reached forward, placing her hand firmly on the console. A strange sensation washed over her as the ship seemed to pulse with her own heartbeat. It was as if the weapon was reading her thoughts, sensing with her very will. The cannon's energy spiked, surging to a level that made the entire Aegis groan under the strain. "We've got one chance," Doran said, his voice low, tense. "Fire when you're ready." Hawk took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the decision. If they missed, if they failed to harness the power correctly, they would be sitting ducks. The enemy would tear them apart. But she didn't flinch. She had no choice. The fate of the crew, the Aegis, and perhaps the entire galaxy rested on this moment. With a single commanding motion, she slammed her hand down on the firing sequence. A pulse of pure, concentrated energy shot forward from the cannon, streaking through the void like a bolt of lightning. The light was blinding, and for a moment, nothing else existed except the roar of raw power. As the energy shot out, it distorted the space around it, bending reality itself as it collided with the first enemy ship. The impact was devastating. The twisted form of the ship seemed to fracture as the energy hit it, sending a shockwave through space. The ship's structure unraveled, the dark anomaly it had been dissolving into a cloud of disintegrating particles. The energy didn't just destroy, it unmade the ship, ripping apart the very fabric of its existence. The crew watched in awe, but there was no time to celebrate. The remaining enemy vessels adjusted quickly, their movement erratic and unpredictable, as though they had learned something from the first strike. One of them charged forward, twisting in on itself and disappearing, only to reappear right next to the Aegis, its dark form flickering in and out of existence. "They're adapting," Mira said, her voice tight with fear. "They know what we're capable of now. They won't make the same mistake twice." The Aegis rocked as another pulse of energy hit it from the enemy vessel, sending the entire bridge into disarray. Sparks flew from the consoles, alarms blared, and crew members were thrown off balance. Hawk gritted her teeth, steadying herself. "Return fire. Focus on that ship. We've got to keep them off us while we power up again." "Captain," Jackson called, looking at the rapidly fluctuating readouts, "we're at 30% power. The cannon's charging, but it'll take time. We can't keep up this pace for long." The enemy ships were closing in again, their forms warping like shadows in the dark. The Aegis shuddered under another blow, and Hawk knew that their window of opportunity was shrinking fast. The weapon was their best hope, but would it be enough to stop the tide of the coming storm? The crew was fighting on borrowed time. With each pulse of energy they fired, threatening to drain the warship's power beyond repair. And with every passing second, the enemy was learning, adapting, growing more dangerous. The first strike had been a victory. But the war was just beginning. The Aegis shook again, this time with an even greater intensity. The enemy ships were relentless, their dark, twisted forms flickering through space like phantoms, weaving in and out of reality, as if mocking the laws of physics, every time they struck. The ship trembled, its shields buckling under the onslaught. The power in the warship's cannon surged again, but it was evident that they couldn't keep up the barrage for much longer. "We're down to 15% power, Captain," Jackson reported, his voice strained. "At this rate, the cannon will overload before we can fire again." Hawk felt a surge of frustration, but kept it in check. Time was running out. They had one weapon, one chance to turn the tide, and it was slipping through their fingers. The enemy ships were adapting too quickly, adjusting their attacks faster than they could respond. They were no longer just ships. They were something far worse, something designed to defeat anything in its path. "We need a new strategy," Hawk said, her voice barely above a whisper. "We can't rely on the cannon alone. It's too unstable, and we're running out of time." Lieutenant Doran stepped up, scanning the data on his tactical console. His eyes widened as a new analysis came in. "Captain, I think I found something. The enemy's ships, they're not just using physical attacks. They're warping space in a way I've never seen before. It's like they're creating a feedback loop in the fabric of space itself." "Are you saying they're distorting reality?" Mira asked, her brow furrowed. "That's exactly what I mean," Doran said. "If they keep this up, they'll rip us apart at the atomic level. But there's a way we can use that against them." Hawk looked at him, her mind racing. "What do you have in mind?" "The Warship. Its systems are attuned to the same kinds of energy manipulations the enemy is using," Doran explained, a gleam of realization in his eyes. "If we can link the warship's core to the Aegis's systems and synchronize our power output with theirs, we might be able to destabilize their feedback loop. Essentially, we can create a countermeasure, a disruption that will collapse their warping effect." Hawk's eyes locked onto the tactical officer's face. "Can we do it? Can we make it work before they tear us apart?" "We have no choice," Doran said, his voice firm. "It's risky, but it's our best shot." The crew quickly went to work, their movements a flurry of activity as they linked the Aegis's systems to the warship's core. The power lines buzzed as they rerouted energy, each team member working with the intense focus of someone aware that failure meant certain death. The ship groaned under the strain, the familiar hum turning into a frantic whine as the two systems began to sync. Outside, the enemy ships moved closer, faster now. They were no longer just random attacks. They were a coordinated force, their movements smooth, deliberate. The feedback loop they were generating was closing in around the Aegis, pulling the ship's very molecules apart. The strain was visible in the air, the edges of reality itself blurring and stretching, making it hard for the crew to focus. Jackson glanced at Hawk, sweat beading on his brow. "Captain, we're almost there. We just need a few more seconds to stabilize the link." The ship lurched again, and the feedback rippled through their systems. The walls of the bridge flickered, warping and distorting. Hawk braced herself against the sudden dizziness, her heart pounding in her chest. "Activate it now," Hawk barked, her voice sharp with urgency. Doran hit the final sequence, and for a moment, the entire ship was still. The hum of the warship's core merged with the Aegis's engines, an eerie calm descending over the crew. It was as if the ship had stopped breathing, waiting for the moment to release its power. And then, what? With a crack that sounded like the very fabric of space had torn, a blinding pulse shot outward from the combined systems. The energy was raw and uncontrolled, but it didn't matter. It slammed into the enemy fleet with an intensity that shattered their warping effect. The space around them rippled violently as the distortions they'd created were undone, collapsing in on themselves. The feedback loop was gone. The enemy ships, which had been moving faster than ever, suddenly slowed, their disjointed forms flickering in and out of reality. Destabilized. They were exposed. Vulnerable. "Now," Hawk yelled, her eyes locked onto the viewports as the distorted ships writhed in space. With all the remaining energy they had, the warship's cannon flared to life again. Its power synchronized with the disruption wave they had just unleashed. The beam that shot from the cannon was not just destructive. It was a focused storm, an annihilation force designed to erase the very fabric of existence. The enemy ships, already disoriented by the energy feedback, stood no chance. The pulse slammed into them with such force that they ceased to exist entirely, collapsing into nothingness in an instant. The crew stood in stunned silence, watching the space where the enemy fleet had been. It was as though they had never existed. "Did we do it?" Mira asked, her voice shaky, barely above a whisper. Hawk watched the stars beyond the viewport, the silence stretching, waiting for something, anything, to confirm their victory. But it was too quiet. The calm felt like the eye of a storm. "We did," Hawk said, but her voice lacked conviction. Something still gnawed at her, a feeling she couldn't quite shake. The battle was over. But the war? That was far from finished. The silence that followed the destruction of the enemy fleet was deafening. The crew of the Aegis stood frozen, their eyes wide, hearts still pounding in their chests. The viewports offered a blank, empty stretch of space where once the dark, shifting forms of the enemy had loomed. For a moment, it felt like they had won, like the nightmare was over. But Captain Hawk could feel the weight of the silence pressing in on her. Something didn't sit right. She stared out into the void, her mind racing. "It's over," Doran said, his voice carrying a note of disbelief. We actually did it." Hawk didn't answer right away. Her gaze never wavered from the empty expanse. The warship had responded. The cannon had obliterated the enemy. They had won this battle. But the nagging feeling didn't leave her. "Captain," Jackson asked, concern in his voice as he glanced at her, "are we secure? Did we really stop them?" "I don't know," Hawk murmured. She turned slowly from the viewport to face the crew, her expression hardening. That was only one fleet, one small fraction of the enemy force. If they've learned anything from this encounter, they'll be back. And next time, they'll be ready. The room was still for a moment as her words sank in. The victory they had just achieved felt hollow, as though it was only the beginning of something far larger, far darker. "But we have the warship," Jackson said, trying to offer some reassurance. "We've got its power on our side now." Hawk nodded slowly, but even as she spoke, her words felt uncertain. "We don't fully understand its capabilities. We've only just begun to scratch the surface, and we don't know what else is out there. The enemy we just faced, it's only a part of something much bigger." Mira, who had been quiet up until now, looked up from her console. Her face was pale, her eyes wide with something that could only be described as dread. "Captain, I'm picking up something." Another signal, coming from deep in space. Hawk's stomach dropped. "Another fleet." "No," Mira replied, shaking her head. "Something different. It's an energy signature, something we've never seen before. It's immense, far bigger than anything we've encountered so far. I don't think it's just a ship. It's a presence." The words hung in the air, heavy and filled with a terror they hadn't yet encountered. The threat was still out there, and it was far worse than anything they had imagined. Hawk stood tall, pushing down the rising tide of fear within her. She needed to think clearly. "Can you get a fix on its location?" "I'm working on it," Mira said, fingers moving rapidly across the screen. "But the signal is erratic, as though it's shifting, like it's moving across dimensions." Jackson stepped forward, his voice grim. "This isn't just an enemy fleet, is it? It's something else entirely, something beyond anything we've ever dealt with." Hawk's mind raced, piecing together fragments of the alien warship's data. The cryptic messages, the history, the warnings. The dark tendrils that had swept across galaxies, wiping them out of existence. They hadn't just been fighting a war. They had been fighting an entity, something older and more powerful than any civilization, any race. And that entity, it seemed, was still out there, somewhere in the cosmos. "We need to find it," Hawk said, her voice steady despite the rising fear in her chest. "We can't afford to wait for it to find us." Doran nodded. "But we're not ready. We barely survived this first encounter. If we're going to go after it, we need more than just the warship. We need time. Hawk turned toward him, determination hardening her features. Then we'll make time. We'll figure out how to unlock everything this ship has to offer. We'll train, prepare, and we'll go after this thing before it's too late. There was no more doubt in her voice. She knew what had to be done. The crew exchanged uneasy glances, but they understood. The battle they had just fought, the victory they had won, had only been the beginning. The warship's power was their greatest advantage, but even that wasn't enough. Not when the real enemy, an ancient cosmic force, was coming. We'll need to prepare, Jackson said. We'll need to understand everything about this ship, every system, every weapon. And we'll need to train, Doran added, his voice resolute. We can't afford to be caught off guard again. Hawk nodded, her jaw tightening. We'll do everything we can to be ready, because if we don't stop it, there won't be anything left to save. The crew fell into motion, each one moving with purpose. The uncertainty of the moment was heavy, but it was matched by a quiet resolve. They had faced the unimaginable and survived. They had the weapon. They had the ship. And now, they would prepare for the true fight, the one that would determine the fate of not just their world, but the entire universe. The war was far from over. The real battle had just begun.